Miss Marple and the ghost in the granary. The September afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green of Little Wickham, where the annual harvest festival had drawn nearly every soul from the surrounding countryside. Tables groaned under the weight of prize-winning vegetables, homemade preserves, and elaborate flower arrangements, while the sweet scent of Mrs. Pemberton's famous apple tarts mingled with the earthier smell of freshly turned soil from the nearby fields. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly on a wooden bench beside the old oak tree, her knitting needles clicking in a gentle rhythm as she observed the familiar drama of village life unfolding before her. At 73, she had witnessed enough harvest festivals to recognize the subtle tensions that simmered beneath the surface of rural civility. This year, however, there seemed to be an unusual undercurrent of unease threading through the pleasant chatter and forced smiles. "The judging for the prize marrows will begin shortly," announced Mrs. Dolly Bantry, the festival organizer, her voice carrying across the green with practiced authority. She stood beside a magnificent display of oversized vegetables, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, despite the afternoon breeze. "Mr. Thornfield has graciously agreed to serve as our judge once again." A smattering of polite applause followed, though Miss Marple noticed several faces in the crowd that remained conspicuously neutral. Edmund Thornfield, the village's most prosperous landowner, approached the vegetable display with his characteristic air of self-importance. At 62, he cut an imposing figure in his well-tailored tweeds, his weathered hands clasping a walking stick more for effect than necessity. "Splendid turnout this year," Thornfield declared, his voice carrying the clipped tones of inherited authority. "Though I must say, the quality of some entries leaves much to be desired." His pale blue eyes swept over the assembled villagers with barely concealed disdain. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily as she observed the reaction to this casual slight. Young Timothy Hardcastle, whose prize pumpkin occupied a place of honor among the displays, flushed scarlet and clenched his fists. Beside him, his wife Sarah placed a restraining hand on his arm, her own face tight with suppressed anger. "Every year it's the same," muttered Mrs. Crabtree, settling onto the bench beside Miss Marple with a grunt of disapproval. The elderly postmistress had been running the village post office for nearly 4 decades and considered herself privy to every secret worth knowing. That man wouldn't recognize honest work if it bit him on his aristocratic posterior. "Oh, Mrs. Crabtree," Miss Marple replied mildly, her fingers resuming their steady rhythm. "I'm sure Mr. Thornfield means well. These festivals can be such trying occasions for those in positions of responsibility." Mrs. Crabtree snorted. "Responsible? The only thing Edmund Thornfield is responsible for is making life miserable for half the village. Did you know he's raised the rent on the Hardcastle's cottage again? 3rd time in 2 years, and with a new baby coming in the spring." Miss Marple's blue eyes, sharp as winter frost, despite her gentle demeanor, followed the direction of Mrs. Crabtree's nod toward the young couple. Timothy Hardcastle worked as a farm laborer on Thornfield's estate, while Sarah supplemented their meager income by taking in sewing. They were honest, hard-working people who deserved better than the casual cruelty of an indifferent landlord. "And then there's poor Miss Bellwether," Mrs. Crabtree continued, warming to her theme. "Threatened to evict her from Rose Cottage if she doesn't pay the back rent by Christmas. Where's a retired schoolmistress supposed to find that kind of money, I ask you?" Miss Marple glanced toward the refreshment tent, where Miss Cordelia Bellwether was serving tea with her usual quiet dignity. At 58, the former headmistress maintained an erect posture and composed expression that spoke of years spent managing unruly children, though there was something fragile about her composure today, like fine china held together with careful hands. The judging proceeded with Thornfield's typical pomposity, his pronouncements delivered with the air of one accustomed to having his every word treated as gospel. When he awarded first prize to Mrs. Ashford's roses, Mrs. Ashford being the wife of the local magistrate, and one of Thornfield's few social equals, Miss Marple noticed the barely perceptible tightening around Miss Bellwether's eyes. The retired teacher's own rose display, while perhaps less elaborate, showed the loving care of someone who found solace in nurturing beautiful things. "The man has no appreciation for true quality," observed a new voice, and Miss Marple looked up to see Dr. Marcus Webb approaching their bench. The village physician was a man in his early 50s, with prematurely grey hair and the sort of lean, ascetic face that suggested a lifetime of careful observation. He had moved to Little Wickham only 3 years ago, following what Miss Crabtree had delicately referred to as trouble in London, though no one seemed to know the precise nature of that trouble. "Dr. Webb," Miss Marple acknowledged with a slight nod. "How lovely to see you taking part in our little celebration." "Hardly by choice, I'm afraid," Webb replied, his tone carrying a hint of bitterness. "Thornfield has made it quite clear that those who wish to maintain his goodwill are expected to show their faces at such events." Mrs. Crabtree leaned forward conspiratorially. "Still no progress on the cottage lease, then?" Dr. Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Thornfield seems to believe that 3 years of exemplary tenancy and service to the community count for nothing against the unfortunate circumstances that brought me here. He's made it abundantly clear that my lease will not be renewed at year's end." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle clicking, but her attention sharpened. In her experience, it was often the accumulation of small injustices that led to moments of terrible reckoning. Edmund Thornfield was systematically alienating the very people upon whom the village's harmony depended, creating a powder keg of resentment that needed only the right spark to explode. As if summoned by her thoughts, a commotion erupted near the beer tent. A young man, with wild dark hair and paint-stained fingers, was gesticulating angrily at Thornfield, his voice rising above the general hubbub of the festival. "You can't do this," shouted the newcomer, whom Miss Marple recognized as James Whitmore, an artist who had recently taken up residence in the old miller's cottage. "That building has stood empty for 15 years. What possible harm could there be in converting it to a proper studio?" Thornfield's response was delivered with icy calm. "The harm, Mr. Whitmore, lies in setting precedents that encourage every vagrant and bohemian to believe they have a claim on property they neither own nor understand. The granary will remain exactly as it is, or you may find alternative accommodations elsewhere." The crowd had fallen silent, all pretense of festive cheer temporarily abandoned as the confrontation played out before them. James Whitmore stood trembling with rage, his hands clenched at his sides, while Thornfield regarded him with the sort of cold dismissal one might reserve for an importunate beggar. "You'll regret this," Whitmore said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Mark my words, Thornfield. You'll regret treating people like disposable chattels." With that, he turned and stalked away toward the old footpath that led to the abandoned granary, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken tensions. Miss Marple observed the faces around her with particular interest. Timothy Hardcastle's savage satisfaction at seeing Thornfield publicly challenged, Miss Bellwether's carefully concealed approval, Dr. Webb's thoughtful expression as he watched the young artist retreat. Mrs. Bantry, ever the social coordinator, clapped her hands together with forced brightness. "Well then, shall we proceed with the children's games? I believe the sack races are next on our program." But the festive atmosphere had been irrevocably altered. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple noticed how conversations died when Thornfield approached groups of villagers, how forced the laughter became, how many meaningful glances were exchanged when the landowner's back was turned. It reminded her rather unpleasantly of her nephew Raymond's description of the calm before a violent thunderstorm, the peculiar stillness in the air that preceded nature's most destructive displays. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting the old granary in deep shadow against the darkening sky, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to take her leave. Tomorrow, she reflected, would bring its own revelation. In her long experience, confrontations like the one they had witnessed seldom ended with mere words, particularly when pride and desperation collided in such spectacular fashion. She had no way of knowing, as she made her way along the familiar lanes toward her cottage, that before another sunset graced Little Wickham, the village would be forever changed by a discovery that would transform their harvest celebration into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The following morning dawned grey and drizzly, with the sort of persistent mist that seemed to cling to the Cotswold valleys like a reluctant ghost. Miss Marple was tending to her small herb garden when the sound of urgent footsteps on the gravel path drew her attention from the rosemary she had been carefully pruning. "Miss Marple! Oh, Miss Marple!" The voice belonged to young Peggy Morrison, the baker's daughter, whose cheeks were flushed with excitement and exertion. At 19, Peggy possessed the sort of boundless energy that made her the unofficial messenger for any village crisis, and her current state of agitation suggested news of considerable import. "My dear child," Miss Marple said gently, setting down her gardening shears, "do catch your breath. Whatever has happened can surely wait for you to compose yourself." Peggy pressed a hand to her chest, gulping air between words. It's Mr. Thornfield, Miss Marple. It's too dreadful to say." A cold finger of premonition traced its way down Miss Marple's spine. In her considerable experience, when young people found something too dreadful to say, it usually involved either scandal or death. And given yesterday's tensions, she rather feared it might be the latter. "Take your time, dear," she encouraged, guiding Peggy to the small wooden bench beside her cottage door. "Start from the beginning." "Well," Peggy began, her breathing gradually steadying, "you know how Mr. Thornfield always takes his morning constitutional through the estate grounds. Regular as clockwork he is, rain or shine. Well, this morning he didn't come back for his breakfast, and Mrs. Hartwell, that's his housekeeper, you know, she got worried after an hour had passed." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Mrs. Hartwell had been keeping house for the Thornfield family for nearly 30 years, and was known for her punctuality and attention to routine. So she sent young Billy Crowther out to look for him. Peggy continued, and Billy found him in the old granary. Stone dead, Miss Marple, lying at the bottom of those rickety stairs that lead up to the loft, with his head. She shuddered delicately. "Well, it was quite obvious he'd taken a terrible fall." "How very sad," Miss Marple murmured, though her mind was already racing through the implications. "I suppose Dr. Webb has been summoned." "Oh yes, and Constable Fletcher, too. They're all up there now, examining the scene. Dr. Webb says it looks like an accident. Those old wooden steps have been rotting for years. And what with the damp weather," Peggy trailed off, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "But Miss Marple, there's something else, something peculiar." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "Oh, well, you see, Billy Crowther swears he heard the most awful noises coming from the granary last night. Moaning and wailing, like a soul in torment. His grandmother always said the old place was haunted, on account of that poor girl who threw herself from the loft window back in 1847, and Billy's convinced he heard her crying out a warning." "How very dramatic," Miss Marple observed mildly. "And what time would this have been?" "Sometime after midnight, Billy thinks. He was coming back from courting Mary Ashford. Though don't tell her father, mind you, and he heard these terrible sounds drifting across the fields." Fair gave him the shivers. It did. Miss Marple made a mental note of this detail. Billy Crowther was a sensible young man, not given to flights of fancy, and his account deserved consideration despite its supernatural overtones. In her experience, ghost stories often contained grains of very earthly truth. "I suppose the constable will want to speak with anyone who might have been in the vicinity last night," she suggested delicately. Peggy's eyes widened. "No, that's just it, Miss Marple. That artist fellow, Mr. Whitmore, he's nowhere to be found. His cottage is empty, and Mrs. Pemberton says she saw him heading toward the granary with a lantern around 11:30. Some folks are saying," she lowered her voice to a whisper, "some folks are saying he might have done something to Mr. Thornfield after that row yesterday." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, and both women turned to see Dr. Webb's modest trap coming down the lane at a considerably faster pace than usual. The doctor's face was grim as he pulled up before Miss Marple's gate, and she could see from his expression that the morning's discoveries had been even more troubling than Peggy's breathless account had suggested. "Miss Marple," Dr. Webb called out, "I wonder if I might have a word." She approached the trap with her characteristic unhurried gait, noting the tension in the doctor's shoulders and the way his hands gripped the reins with unnecessary force. "Certainly, Dr. Webb. I trust you've completed your examination of poor Mr. Thornfield." "After a fashion," Webb replied grimly. "Though I must say, this business has some rather puzzling aspects. The fall certainly appears to have been the immediate cause of death. But," he glanced meaningfully at Peggy, who was listening with rapt attention, "perhaps you'd care to step inside for a cup of tea?" Miss Marple suggested. "Peggy, dear, I'm sure your mother will be wondering where you've gotten to." The girl's face fell with disappointment, but she obediently gathered her skirts and headed back toward the village center, no doubt eager to spread her dramatic news to anyone who would listen. Once they were settled in Miss Marple's cozy sitting room, with a proper pot of tea between them, Dr. Webb's professional composure began to crack slightly. "The thing is," he began without preamble, "while the injuries are certainly consistent with a fall down those stairs, there are some details that don't quite fit the obvious explanation." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her expression encouraging him to continue. "For one thing, Thornfield's walking stick was found at the top of the stairs, not near his body as one might expect if he'd been using it for support. And there were no obvious signs of the wood giving way, no splintered boards or broken railings that might explain why he fell." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps he had gone up to the loft for some reason and stumbled on his way down." "That's what I thought initially," Webb admitted. "But here's the peculiar thing. There were fresh candle drippings on the loft floor, as if someone had been up there recently with a light, and the dust had been disturbed in a pattern that suggested more than one person had been moving about." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been maintaining their gentle rhythm, paused almost imperceptibly. "More than one person." The footprints in the dust were quite clear, at least until Constable Fletcher and his men trampled about. I could make out what appeared to be two distinct sets, one matching Thornfield's boots and another considerably smaller, with a different tread pattern. "And Mr. Whitmore, has he been located?" Dr. Webb's expression darkened. "That's another troubling aspect of this affair. His cottage appears to have been hastily abandoned sometime during the night. Personal effects scattered about, a half-finished painting left on the easel, and his bed clearly unslept in. Constable Fletcher has organized a search party, but I fear young Whitmore may have fled the district entirely." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, though the picture they formed was still frustratingly incomplete. In her experience, when an unpopular man died under suspicious circumstances and the most obvious suspect promptly disappeared, the truth was usually rather more complex than it initially appeared. "Tell me, Dr. Webb," she said eventually, "in your professional opinion, could Mr. Thornfield's injuries have been caused by something other than a simple fall?" The doctor was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his teacup in a nervous rhythm. "That's the question that's been troubling me all morning," he admitted finally. "While the skull fracture is consistent with striking the stone floor at the base of the stairs, there's also evidence of what might be a separate blow to the back of the head, something that could have occurred before the fall." "You're suggesting he might have been struck first, then pushed down the stairs?" "I'm suggesting nothing of the sort," Webb replied quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Merely noting that the physical evidence is ambiguous. It's entirely possible that he struck his head on something as he fell, creating what appears to be a secondary injury." Miss Marple nodded understanding. Dr. Webb was a cautious man, made more so by whatever circumstances had driven him from London, and he would be reluctant to voice suspicions without absolute certainty. "Of course," she agreed mildly. "And I suppose Constable Fletcher is treating this as an accidental death?" "For the moment, yes. Though he's asked me to conduct a more thorough examination this afternoon, once the body can be moved to more suitable facilities." Webb paused, then added quietly, "I don't suppose you noticed anything unusual last night? Any sounds or disturbances that seemed out of place?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Her cottage was situated on the outskirts of the village, with a clear view across the fields toward the old granary, and she was a naturally light sleeper. "I did wake briefly sometime after midnight," she admitted. "There was a sound that seemed rather like someone calling out, though it was quite distant, and I thought perhaps it was merely a night bird, or some creature in distress." "A calling out?" Webb leaned forward with interest. "It lasted only a moment or two, and then all was quiet again. I'm afraid I thought no more of it at the time." She paused, then added delicately, "Though now that you mention it, there did seem to be a light moving about near the granary sometime earlier in the evening. I noticed it when I drew the curtains before retiring." Dr. Webb set down his teacup with a sharp clink. "What time would that have been?" "Perhaps 11 o'clock, or a bit after. Just a small light, bobbing along the footpath that leads from the village toward the old building. I assumed it was someone taking a late evening walk, though it did seem rather an odd time for such an expedition." The two sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Dr. Webb rose to take his leave, his expression troubled. "I fear this business is going to cause considerable upheaval in the village," he said, as Miss Marple saw him to the door. "Whatever the truth of how Thornfield died, his death will have far-reaching consequences for a great many people." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Indeed, though I suspect those consequences may prove to be rather different from what anyone expects." As she watched the doctor's trap disappear down the lane, she reflected on the curious chain of events that had begun with yesterday's harvest festival confrontation and culminated in this morning's grim discovery. In her considerable experience with the darker aspects of human nature, she had learned that the most obvious explanation was often the least accurate, and that the truth usually lay hidden beneath layers of assumption and prejudice. The disappearance of James Whitmore was certainly suggestive, but Miss Marple had observed enough of village life to know that guilt and innocence rarely distributed themselves as neatly as the authorities preferred to believe. Before this matter was resolved, she suspected, a great many carefully guarded secrets would be dragged into the unforgiving light of day. By afternoon, news of Edmund Thornfield's death had spread through Little Wickham, with the inexorable efficiency of spilled water, finding every crack in a foundation. The village shop had become an impromptu gathering place, where theories were exchanged with the same fervor typically reserved for discussions of weather and crops. Miss Marple entered Merriman's general store, ostensibly to purchase a skein of wool for her knitting, but in reality to observe the various reactions to the morning's dramatic events. She had long ago discovered that people revealed their true natures most clearly in moments of crisis, when the usual social constraints loosened and genuine emotions bubbled to the surface. "I tell you, it's a judgment from above," Mrs. Crabtree was declaring to a small but attentive audience. "That man spent years grinding decent folk under his heel, and now he's met his end in the most fitting way possible, brought low by his own pride and arrogance." "Now, Mrs. Crabtree," protested Mr. Merriman from behind his counter, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely disagree with the sentiment. "Speaking ill of the dead isn't proper, no matter what sort of man he might have been in life." Miss Marple selected her wool with deliberate care, positioning herself where she could observe the assembled villagers without appearing to eavesdrop. The group included most of the same faces she had seen at yesterday's festival, though their expressions now bore the particular mixture of excitement and unease that accompanied any brush with mortality. "Proper or not," interjected Timothy Hardcastle, his young face flushed with poorly concealed satisfaction, "it's the truth. How many families in this village were living in fear of eviction because of that man's greed? How many decent people were forced to scrape and bow just to keep a roof over their heads?" His wife Sarah placed a restraining hand on his arm, her eyes darting nervously around the shop. "Tim, please, this isn't the time or place for such talk." But Timothy shook off her touch, emboldened by the morning's events and the sympathetic faces surrounding him. "When is the right time, Sarah? When we're packing our belongings because we can't afford another rent increase? When Miss Bellwether is turned out of Rose Cottage like a common vagrant?" Miss Marple's attention sharpened at the mention of the retired schoolmistress. She glanced toward the corner where Miss Bellwether stood quietly examining a display of tinned goods, her refined features carefully composed, but her hands trembling slightly as she pretended to read labels. "The young man has a point," observed Mrs. Pemberton, the baker's wife, her flour-dusted apron lending an air of domestic authority to her pronouncements. "Thornfield's death may be a tragedy for his family, but it's salvation for half the village. His heir might prove more reasonable about these matters." "His heir?" Miss Marple inquired gently, approaching the group with her selected wool. "I wasn't aware Mr. Thornfield had family." Mrs. Crabtree seized upon this opportunity to display her superior knowledge of village affairs. "Oh yes, there's a nephew in London, city solicitor I believe, though I hear he and his uncle weren't on speaking terms. Something about a disagreement over money, as these things usually are." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. "Family quarrels are always so distressing, particularly when death intervenes before they can be properly resolved." The shop bell chimed as the door opened to admit Constable Fletcher, his usually ruddy face grave with official responsibility. At 45, Fletcher had been the village constable for nearly 2 decades, and his presence immediately altered the atmosphere in the shop, from gossipy speculation to cautious formality. "Afternoon, all," Fletcher said, touching his cap politely. I wonder if I might have a word with anyone who was in the vicinity of the old granary last evening. Part of the routine inquiry, you understand. The silence that followed this request was pregnant with unspoken tensions. Miss Marple observed the various reactions with interest. Timothy Hardcastle's defiant expression, Sarah's nervous fidgeting, Miss Bellwether's careful stillness, and Mrs. Crabtree's barely suppressed eagerness to share whatever gossip she might possess. I already told young Billy Crowther what I knew. Mrs. Pemberton volunteered finally. Saw that artist fellow heading toward the granary with a lantern sometime before midnight. Couldn't sleep on account of my Arthur's snoring, and I happened to glance out the bedroom window. Fletcher produced a small notebook from his breast pocket and made a careful entry. Anyone else notice Mr. Whitmore's movements last evening? Miss Bellwether cleared her throat delicately. I saw a light moving about the granary around 11 o'clock, though I couldn't say with certainty who might have been carrying it. You were out rather late, Miss Bellwether, Fletcher observed, not unkindly. A faint flush colored the retired teacher's pale cheeks. I often take a constitution in the evening, Constable. I find it helps with my digestion. Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation and filed it away for future consideration. In her experience, people rarely had trouble explaining their legitimate activities, and Miss Bellwether's discomfort suggested there might be more to her late-night walk than simple digestive concerns. And you, Mr. Hardcastle, Fletcher continued, I don't suppose you noticed anything unusual. Timothy's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might refuse to answer entirely. Finally, he said grudgingly, I was home with my wife all evening. Sarah can vouch for that. The young woman nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly for complete credibility. Yes, we retired early. Timothy has been working extra hours with the harvest coming in. Fletcher made another note, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the constable's investigation would prove thorough enough to uncover the various deceptions that seemed to be multiplying around Thornfield's death, like mushrooms after rain. Has there been any word of Mr. Whitmore's whereabouts? She inquired politely. Fletcher's expression darkened. Not as yet, though we're making inquiries. His sudden departure does raise certain questions about his possible involvement in last night's events. But surely, Miss Bellwether interjected with something approaching her old teaching authority. A man's decision to leave the village doesn't necessarily indicate guilt. Perhaps he simply felt unwelcome after yesterday's unpleasant confrontation with Mr. Thornfield. Perhaps, Fletcher agreed non-committally. Though it would certainly be helpful if he could account for his movements last evening. The bell chimed again as Dr. Webb entered the shop, his medical bag in hand, and his expression even more troubled than it had been that morning. He nodded politely to the assembled villagers, but made no attempt to join their conversation, instead approaching Miss Merriman with a request for various supplies. Miss Marple observed the doctor's careful avoidance of the group, with interest. As the person who had examined Thornfield's body most thoroughly, Webb would naturally be the focus of considerable curiosity, and his reticence suggested he had discovered something that troubled him. Dr. Webb, Constable Fletcher called out, I wonder if you might spare a moment to discuss your preliminary findings. Webb's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. Perhaps we might speak privately, Constable. There are certain medical details that wouldn't be appropriate to discuss in mixed company. The two men withdrew to a corner of the shop, their voices dropping to urgent whispers that nonetheless carried hints of disagreement. Miss Marple caught fragments of their conversation, something about inconsistent injuries and need for further examination before they moved their discussion entirely outside. The remaining villagers exchanged meaningful glances, their curiosity clearly piqued by this display of official concern. Mark my words, Mrs. Crabtree declared with dark satisfaction, there's more to this business than a simple accident. That young artist may have fled, but I'll wager he's not the only one with secrets to hide. Miss Bellwether drew herself up with visible effort. Really, Mrs. Crabtree, I think we should avoid such speculation. Whatever the circumstances of Mr. Thornfield's death, he deserves our respect and prayers, not idle gossip and unfounded accusations. Respect? Timothy Hardcastle's voice cracked with suppressed emotion. Where was his respect when he threatened to evict my wife and unborn child? Where was his Christian charity when he squeezed every penny from folk who could barely afford to eat? The shop fell silent again, the uncomfortable truth of Timothy's words, settling over the gathering like a shroud. Miss Marple reflected that Edmund Thornfield's death had indeed been a liberation of sorts, though not necessarily in the way that anyone had intended. As she prepared to take her leave, purchasing her wool with the same unhurried deliberation she brought to all her activities, Miss Marple found herself considering the various currents of emotions swirling beneath the village's surface. Fear, relief, guilt and anger all played their parts in the unfolding drama. But she suspected the most dangerous emotion of all was the one being most carefully concealed. In her long experience with the darker aspects of human nature, she had learned that the most devastating secrets were often those that people kept from themselves. Before this matter was resolved, she feared that more than one carefully constructed life would crumble under the weight of long-buried truths. The afternoon shadows were lengthening as she walked home through the familiar lanes, her mind already beginning to arrange the scattered pieces of information into patterns that might eventually reveal the whole picture. Tomorrow, she decided, would be an excellent day for a visit to Rose Cottage, where Miss Bellwether might be persuaded to share whatever knowledge lay behind her carefully guarded expressions. After all, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, retired schoolmistresses were often the keepers of a village's most significant secrets. The next morning brought crisp autumn sunshine that seemed to mock the somber mood hanging over Little Wickham like a persistent fog. Miss Marple made her way along the winding lane to Rose Cottage, with a small basket containing a jar of her homemade blackberry preserves and a sense of purpose that her gentle demeanor carefully concealed. Rose Cottage sat at the edge of the village proper, a charming structure of honey-colored stone that had been Miss Bellwether's refuge since her retirement from teaching 15 years earlier. The garden, though showing signs of careful economy, still maintained the sort of precise beauty that spoke of both horticultural knowledge and limited resources. Miss Bellwether answered the door with the composed expression she had worn in yesterday's shop, though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected signs of strain around her eyes and a slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her grey skirt. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to call," Miss Bellwether said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of her teaching years. "Do please come in." The cottage's interior reflected its owner's refined taste, constrained by financial necessity. The furniture was well maintained, but clearly aging, the wallpaper faded, but scrupulously clean, and the overall effect was one of genteel poverty born with dignity. "I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion," Miss Marple said as she was ushered into the small sitting room, "but I thought you might appreciate some company during these distressing times. Village tragedies have a way of affecting us all, don't they?" Miss Bellwether's composure flickered momentarily before reasserting itself. "How kind of you to think of me, though I must say, while Mr. Thornfield's death is certainly shocking, I can hardly claim to be personally affected by it." Miss Marple settled into the offered armchair with her characteristic unhurried grace, noting the way Miss Bellwether's fingers worried at the fabric of her skirt, a nervous gesture at odds with her carefully controlled voice. "Of course not, dear," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I imagine his passing must bring a certain relief regarding your housing situation. Will his heir prove more reasonable about the rent arrears, do you suppose?" The direct question struck home with the precision of a well-aimed arrow. Miss Bellwether's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, and for a moment her face showed the desperate exhaustion of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for far too long. How did you know about that?" she asked weakly. "Village gossip, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied with gentle regret. "Mrs. Crabtree mentioned something about Christmas deadlines and eviction notices. Such a distressing situation for someone who gave so many years to educating the village children." Miss Bellwether rose abruptly and moved to the window, her back rigid with suppressed emotion. 37 years I taught in this village," she said quietly. 37 years of molding young minds and instilling proper values. And what do I have to show for it? A pittance of a pension and the constant threat of homelessness." Miss Marple made sympathetic sounds while her sharp mind filed away. This revelation, financial desperation, was one of the oldest and most powerful motives for extreme action, and Miss Bellwether's situation was clearly more dire than she had previously let on. "The teaching profession has never been adequately compensated," Miss Marple observed, "though I'm sure your former pupils remember your dedication with gratitude." Gratitude doesn't pay the bills, Miss Bellwether replied with uncharacteristic bitterness. Do you know what Mr. Thornfield said when I begged him for more time? He said that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford in business matters, and that Rose Cottage could command a higher rent from more suitable tenants. She turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Suitable tenants. As if 40 years of blameless residence counted for nothing against the prospect of a few extra pounds per month. Miss Marple clucked her tongue sympathetically. How very heartless of him. I don't suppose you were able to make alternative arrangements. Miss Bellwether's composure crumbled entirely, and she sank into her chair with the defeated air of someone who had reached the end of their resources. What alternatives could there be? My savings are exhausted. My pension barely covers my basic expenses, and at my age, who would employ me? The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither woman acknowledged directly. Miss Marple waited patiently, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm, while she allowed the silence to work its magic. I suppose, Miss Bellwether continued eventually, I should feel grateful that his death has bought me time. His heir will hardly wish to deal with eviction proceedings while settling the estate. And perhaps, she trailed off, as if reluctant to voice whatever hope she was nurturing, perhaps the new owner will prove more understanding, Miss Marple suggested gently. Perhaps. Miss Bellwether's voice carried little conviction. Though I fear my situation will seem just as burdensome to him, whoever he may be. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression one of kindly concern. Forgive me for asking, dear, but on the night Mr. Thornfield died, you mentioned taking an evening constitutional for your digestion. I don't suppose you encountered him during your walk. The question seemed to strike Miss Bellwether like a physical blow. Her face went quite pale, and her hands clenched in her lap with enough force to whiten her knuckles. No, of course not, she stammered. That is, I saw the light at the Granary, as I mentioned to Constable Fletcher, but I had no idea it might be Mr. Thornfield. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. How curious that he should have been visiting the Granary at such an hour. I wonder what could have drawn him there. I'm sure I couldn't say, Miss Bellwether replied quickly. Too quickly. Perhaps he was investigating reports of trespassers. You know how concerned he was about his property rights. The explanation had the hollow ring of something rehearsed, and Miss Marple filed it away alongside her growing collection of suspicious details. In her experience, when people began offering unsolicited explanations for events they claimed to know nothing about, they invariably knew considerably more than they were willing to admit. Of course, she agreed mildly, though it does seem rather dangerous to investigate such matters alone, particularly given the condition of those old stairs. I understand they've been deteriorating for years. Miss Bellwether's hands resumed their nervous fidgeting. Yes, everyone knew they were unsafe. It's tragic that Mr. Thornfield should have met his end in such a fashion. Indeed, though I understand Dr. Webb has some concerns about the exact circumstances of the accident. Something about the nature of the injuries not quite matching what one would expect from a simple fall. This casual revelation had the effect Miss Marple had intended. Miss Bellwether went very still, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the implications sank in. Concerns? She whispered. What sort of concerns? Oh, I'm sure it's nothing significant, Miss Marple replied with studied nonchalance. Medical men are naturally cautious about such matters, though I believe Constable Fletcher has requested a more thorough examination of the body. Miss Bellwether rose abruptly from her chair, moving to the mantelpiece, where she began rearranging a collection of small ornaments with trembling fingers. I see. And I suppose this means the investigation will be more extensive than initially expected. Very likely, Miss Marple confirmed. These official inquiries have a way of uncovering all sorts of unexpected details about people's movements and activities. I'm sure everyone who was in the vicinity that night will be questioned quite thoroughly. The sound of breaking china filled the small room, as Miss Bellwether's nervous fingers knocked a delicate figurine to the hearth. She stared at the scattered pieces with an expression of such profound despair that Miss Marple felt a genuine pang of sympathy for the woman's obvious distress. Oh dear, Miss Bellwether whispered, kneeling to gather the fragments. Mother's shepherdess. She brought it back from Dresden before the war. And now, accidents happen to the best of us, Miss Marple said gently, rising to help with the cleanup. Though sometimes broken things can be mended more easily than we expect. As they knelt together on the worn carpet, Miss Bellwether suddenly grasped Miss Marple's wrist, with surprising strength. Her eyes were wide with something approaching panic, and her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. Miss Marple, if someone had done something terrible, something they never intended to do, what would you advise them? The question hung between them like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Miss Marple met the younger woman's desperate gaze with compassion, but also with the steady resolve that had guided her through countless similar moments of human crisis. I would advise them, she said quietly, that the truth has a way of emerging regardless of our intentions, and that facing it with courage and honesty is usually less painful than allowing it to surface through other means. Miss Bellwether's grip tightened for a moment, then relaxed as she sank back on her heels. Yes, she said distantly. Yes, I suppose you're right. They finished cleaning up the broken figurine in silence, each woman lost in her own thoughts. As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, she noticed a small detail that she had overlooked during her initial survey of the cottage. A muddy pair of walking shoes by the back door, their leather stained with what appeared to be candle wax. Thank you for calling, Miss Bellwether said as she saw her visitor to the front door. It's been helpful to talk with someone who understands. Miss Marple paused on the threshold, her gentle expression masking the sharp intelligence working behind her pale blue eyes. We all need someone to talk to during difficult times, dear, and sometimes the burden becomes lighter when it's shared. As she made her way back along the village lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's revelations. Miss Bellwether's financial desperation provided a clear motive. Her obvious distress suggested guilty knowledge, and the physical evidence, muddy shoes and candle wax, hinted at direct involvement in the night's events. Yet something about the retired teacher's manner troubled her. The woman was clearly hiding something significant, but her distress seemed to stem from something deeper than simple fear of discovery. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, genuine murderers rarely displayed such profound remorse immediately after their crimes. No, she decided, as she approached her own cottage gate. Miss Bellwether was certainly involved in Edmund Thornfield's death, but probably not in the way that Constable Fletcher would assume when the evidence inevitably came to light. The truth, as always, would prove to be considerably more complex than the obvious explanation suggested. And somewhere in that complexity lay the real killer, no doubt content to let suspicion fall on more obvious candidates, while their own guilt remained safely hidden. The fourth day following Edmund Thornfield's death brought unexpected developments that would shift the entire complexion of the investigation. Miss Marple was enjoying her morning tea when the sound of urgent voices from the lane drew her to the window, where she observed Constable Fletcher escorting a dishevelled figure toward the village centre. James Whitmore had returned to Little Wickham. The young artist's appearance suggested several days of rough living. His dark hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled and stained, and his face bore the haggard expression of someone who had slept little and worried much. Yet there was something in his bearing that struck Miss Marple as significant, rather than the furtive guilt of a fugitive. He displayed the defiant resignation of someone who had come to a difficult but necessary decision. By afternoon, word had spread that Whitmore had voluntarily surrendered himself to the authorities and was being questioned about his movements on the night of Thornfield's death. Miss Marple found herself oddly troubled by this development. Though she couldn't quite articulate the source of her unease, her contemplations were interrupted by a knock at her door, and she opened it to find Dr. Webb standing on her threshold, with an expression of barely controlled agitation. Miss Marple, he said without preamble, I wonder if I might impose upon your time once again. There have been some developments that I find disturbing. She ushered him into her sitting room, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands trembled slightly as he accepted a cup of tea. Whatever had transpired during his more thorough examination of Thornfield's body had clearly shaken his professional composure. I've completed my detailed examination, Webb began, his voice tight with controlled emotion, and I'm afraid my initial concerns were justified. Edmund Thornfield was almost certainly murdered. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, though her attention sharpened considerably. You're quite certain? The evidence is unmistakable once one knows what to look for, Webb replied grimly. There are two distinct head injuries, the obvious skull fracture from the fall, and a separate contusion at the base of the skull that occurred before death. Someone struck him from behind with considerable force, likely rendering him unconscious before he fell down those stairs. And you've reported this to Constable Fletcher? Webb's expression darkened. That's where the situation becomes complicated. Fletcher seems determined to view Whitmore's return as a confession of guilt, and he's not particularly interested in evidence that might complicate that convenient narrative. Miss Marple paused in her knitting to give the doctor her full attention. You believe Mr. Whitmore is innocent? I spoke with him briefly while Fletcher was occupied with paperwork, Webb admitted. The young man claims he went to the granary that night to retrieve some painting supplies he'd hidden there, despite Thornfield's prohibition. He says he found the body at the bottom of the stairs and panicked, fleeing because he was afraid no one would believe his innocence. And do you believe him? Webb was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the careful deliberation of someone whose professional reputation depended on accurate judgments. His account of finding the body matches the physical evidence I observed, he said finally. More importantly, the timing doesn't fit. Based on the state of rigor mortis and other factors, I estimate Thornfield died sometime between 11 and midnight. Whitmore claims he didn't arrive at the granary until well after midnight, which would be consistent with Mrs. Pemberton's observation of him heading in that direction. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. So if Mr. Whitmore is telling the truth, someone else encountered Mr. Thornfield at the granary earlier in the evening. Precisely, and that someone struck him down before Whitmore ever arrived on the scene. The implications of this revelation settled over them like a heavy blanket. If Whitmore was innocent, then the real murderer remained at large, probably feeling quite secure in the knowledge that suspicion had fallen on the most obvious candidate. Has Mr. Whitmore offered any explanation for why Mr. Thornfield might have been at the granary in the first place? Miss Marple inquired. That's another curious aspect of his story, Webb replied. He claims that when he arrived, there were signs that someone else had been there recently. Fresh candle drippings, as I mentioned before, and evidence that the loft space had been thoroughly searched. Searched? For what purpose? Whitmore had no idea, though he mentioned that Thornfield seemed particularly agitated during their confrontation at the festival. Something about setting precedents and property rights, as if the granary held some significance beyond its mere monetary value. Miss Marple's mind began working through the possibilities, with a systematic precision that had served her well in previous investigations. The granary was a substantial building that had stood empty for 15 years, yet Thornfield had been adamant about preventing its conversion to an artist's studio. Such vehemence suggested motives beyond simple property management. I don't suppose, she said carefully, that anyone has thought to investigate what might be hidden in the granary itself. If it was indeed being searched, the searcher must have been looking for something specific. Webb's eyes widened with the realization. Of course, if Thornfield was meeting someone there, it must have been about whatever they hoped to find. The murder might have occurred when that search went wrong somehow, or when Mr. Thornfield discovered something he wasn't meant to see, Miss Marple suggested quietly. They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, each following their own chains of reasoning through the maze of possibilities. Finally, Webb rose to take his leave, his expression troubled but determined. I'm going to press Fletcher to conduct a thorough search of the granary, he declared. If there's evidence there that might exonerate Whitmore, it needs to be found before an innocent man is charged with murder. After the doctor's departure, Miss Marple found herself unable to concentrate on her usual domestic activities. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to suggest a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Someone had lured or arranged to meet Thornfield at the granary, possibly under the pretense of revealing or retrieving something hidden there. That meeting had ended in violence, and the killer had been fortunate enough to have their crime attributed to a convenient suspect. But who had both the motive and the opportunity to commit such a deed? Timothy Hardcastle had the anger, but lacked the cunning for such elaborate deception. Miss Bellwether possessed the intelligence, but seemed too genuinely distraught for cold-blooded calculation, and there were undoubtedly other villagers with grievances against Thornfield that had yet to come to light. As evening approached, Miss Marple made a decision that would have surprised those who knew her only as a gentle spinster devoted to knitting and gardening. She retrieved a small lantern from her pantry, wrapped herself in a dark shawl, and set out across the fields toward the old granary. If answers were to be found in that abandoned building, she intended to discover them before anyone else had the chance to remove or destroy the evidence. In her considerable experience with human nature, murderers who thought themselves safe were often careless about covering their tracks completely. The granary loomed against the star-filled sky like a monument to forgotten purposes, its broken windows staring blindly across the darkened fields. Miss Marple approached it with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that the most dangerous moment in any investigation was often when the truth was closest to being revealed. Inside, her lantern light revealed the scene much as Dr. Webb had described it. The blood stain at the base of the rickety stairs, the disturbed dust in the loft above, and the general air of a place where violence had recently intruded upon long-standing peace. But there was something else, something that the official investigation had apparently overlooked in their focus on the immediate evidence of Thornfield's death. In the far corner of the loft, partially concealed behind a fallen beam, Miss Marple's lantern revealed the edge of what appeared to be a wooden chest or strongbox. With considerable effort, she managed to pull the container into the light, where its significance became immediately apparent. The chest was old, but well maintained, secured with a brass lock that showed signs of recent tampering. Whatever secrets it contained, someone had been desperately eager to access them, and that desperation, Miss Marple reflected as she examined the damaged lock more closely, had ultimately led to Edmund Thornfield's death. The question now was whether those same secrets might prove dangerous to anyone else who discovered them. Miss Marple's careful examination of the damaged chest revealed that while the lock had been forced, it had been done with considerable skill rather than brute force. The scratches around the mechanism suggested the use of proper tools wielded by someone with experience in such matters, not the desperate improvisation of an amateur burglar. With some difficulty, she managed to open the lid, her lantern light revealing contents that immediately explained both Thornfield's presence at the granary and his subsequent murder. The chest contained a collection of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be several leather-bound ledgers, all wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from the damp. The topmost document was a letter dated some 20 years earlier, written in a feminine hand and addressed to "My dearest Edmund." Miss Marple read the first few lines, with growing comprehension of the explosive nature of what she had discovered. "My darling, I cannot continue this deception much longer. Harold grows suspicious of my frequent absences, and I fear what he might do if he discovers our correspondence. The child grows stronger each day, and I see so much of you in his features that I sometimes wonder how anyone could fail to notice." The letter was signed "Your devoted Constance," and attached to it was a photograph of a young woman holding an infant, with a notation on the reverse identifying them as C. Miss Marple sat back on her heels, the implications washing over her like a cold tide. Constance Ashford, now the magistrate's wife, and one of the village's most respected matrons, had conducted an affair with Edmund Thornfield that had resulted in an illegitimate child. The timing suggested that child would now be approximately 20 years old, which meant she reached for one of the ledgers, her suspicions confirmed by the meticulous records it contained. For 2 decades, Thornfield had been paying substantial sums to ensure the secret remained buried, though whether the payments were made from guilt, blackmail, or genuine affection for his former lover remained unclear. But the most damning evidence lay in the final entries, dated just 3 months earlier. The payments had stopped abruptly, with a notation in Thornfield's precise handwriting: "CA demands impossible increase. Situation untenable. Alternative measures required." Miss Marple carefully photographed the critical documents with her memory, then replaced them in the chest exactly as she had found them. The killer would undoubtedly return to retrieve this evidence once the immediate investigation cooled, and she had no intention of alerting them to her discovery prematurely. As she prepared to leave the granary, the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path outside sent her scrambling to extinguish her lantern. Heart pounding with an excitement she hadn't felt in years, she pressed herself against the wall beside the doorway and waited. The newcomer entered the granary with confident familiarity, clearly knowing exactly where they were heading. Miss Marple caught a glimpse of a dark figure moving purposefully toward the loft stairs, carrying a small electric torch whose beam cut through the darkness with modern efficiency. She followed as quietly as her elderly joints would allow, positioning herself where she could observe without being detected. The figure moved directly to the concealed chest, examining it with obvious frustration upon discovering that the lock had already been forced. "Damn!" came a whispered curse in a voice Miss Marple recognized with shock. "Someone's been here first." The figure began rifling through the chest's contents, with increasing desperation, apparently searching for something specific among the documents. In their haste, they failed to notice the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs behind them. "Looking for something in particular?" Miss Marple inquired mildly, her voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. The figure spun around with a gasp of terror, the torch beam swinging wildly before settling on Miss Marple's composed features. In its reflected light, she could clearly see the face of Mrs. Harold Ashford, the magistrate's wife and pillar of village society. "Miss Marple," Constance Ashford's voice cracked with the strain of discovery. What are you doing here?"
"I suspect the same thing you are, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, though perhaps for rather different reasons.
Constance's hand trembled as she lowered the torch, her face aging a decade in the space of a few seconds. At 58, she had maintained the sort of preserved beauty that spoke of careful attention to appearance, and the confidence that came from never having her respectability questioned. Now faced with the collapse of a lifetime's careful construction, she seemed to shrink into herself. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "I suspected something when I realized the true nature of what was hidden in this chest," Miss Marple admitted. "The timing of Edmund's death, your obvious distress despite your public composure, and certain small inconsistencies in the various accounts of that evening, all pointed toward a more complex truth than anyone was willing to acknowledge." Constance sank onto a nearby crate, the torch falling from her nerveless fingers to cast wild shadows on the walls. 23 years, she said distantly. 23 years of living with the fear that someone would discover the truth. Miss Marple settled beside her with the careful movements of age, her expression one of compassionate understanding rather than judgment. "Your son, is he aware of his true parentage?" "God, no." Constance's response was immediate and anguished. "Robert believes Harold is his father, as does everyone else in the village. It would destroy him to learn the truth, destroy his relationship with the man who raised him as his own son." "And Mr. Thornfield, was he threatening to reveal the secret?" Constance's composure crumbled entirely, 20 years of suppressed guilt and terror pouring out in a torrent of confession. "He had been blackmailing me since Robert's birth," she sobbed. "Not for money, you understand, but for consideration, business deals that favored his interests, social influence that advanced his position, 1,000 small corruptions that ate away at my soul." Miss Marple waited patiently for the woman to compose herself sufficiently to continue. "3 months ago, I finally found the courage to say no," Constance continued. "I told him I wouldn't be his puppet anymore, that I would rather face the scandal than continue living as his creature. He laughed and said he would think of something more permanent to ensure my cooperation." "And that brought you to the Granary on the night he died?" Constance nodded miserably. "He sent word that he wanted to meet me there, said he had something to show me that would change my mind about defying him. I knew he must have gathered more evidence somehow, perhaps letters I thought I had destroyed or photographs I had forgotten about." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with the inexorable logic that Miss Marple had learned to recognize over years of observation. "But when you arrived, you found him searching through the chest himself." "He was in a fury," Constance whispered. "Someone had broken into his private safe at the manor and stolen the key to this hiding place. He was convinced I had arranged it somehow, though I swear I knew nothing about any theft." Miss Marple filed away this crucial information while encouraging Constance to continue her confession. "We argued," Constance continued, her voice barely audible. "He threatened to publish everything in the county newspaper, to destroy not just my reputation, but Harold's career and Robert's future. I begged him to reconsider, offered him anything he wanted, but he was beyond reason. And then he turned his back on me, dismissing me like a servant who had displeased him. Something inside me simply snapped. I picked up a piece of broken wood and struck him." Her hands rose to cover her face in horror at the memory. "I never meant to kill him, Miss Marple. I only wanted him to stop, to listen, to show some human decency after all these years." Miss Marple reached out to pat the distraught woman's shoulder with genuine sympathy. And after he fell down the stairs, I panicked, Constance admitted. I grabbed the chest and tried to carry it away, but it was too heavy and I was too frightened to think clearly. In the end, I just ran home and tried to pretend it had never happened. The confession hung between them in the dusty air of the granary, a lifetime of secrets finally brought into the light. Miss Marple sat quietly for several minutes, allowing Constance to absorb the relief and terror that came with the end of deception. "My dear," she said finally, "I'm afraid you've made a terrible mistake in your reasoning." Constance looked up through her tears, confusion replacing despair in her expression. "You see," Miss Marple continued gently, "if someone had indeed broken into Mr. Thornfield's safe to steal the key to this chest, and if that person wasn't you, then they must have been the one searching through these documents when Mr. Thornfield arrived to confront them." The implications of this observation settled over Constance like dawn breaking after a long night. You mean I didn't kill him?" "I rather suspect," Miss Marple said with the quiet certainty that came from years of unraveling human puzzles, "that you arrived at the granary just in time to witness the real murderer disposing of Mr. Thornfield's body by pushing him down those stairs. What you took for the results of your own blow was actually the aftermath of someone else's more calculated crime." Constance stared at her in shock, the possibility of innocence almost too overwhelming to comprehend, after days of believing herself a murderess. But then she whispered, "Who really killed Edmund, and why?" Miss Marple rose from the crate, with a slight smile that would have chilled anyone who truly understood her capabilities. "That, my dear, is what we're going to find out. Though I suspect the answer lies much closer to home than either of us might have imagined." The following morning brought a development that would have surprised anyone who believed they understood the dynamics of Little Wickham's investigation. Miss Marple, having escorted a much-relieved Constance Ashford safely home with promises of discretion regarding her midnight confession, found herself contemplating the true complexity of the case as she tended her morning garden. If Constance had not killed Edmund Thornfield, and Miss Marple was now quite certain she had not, then someone else had broken into Thornfield's safe, stolen the key to the granary chest, and arranged to meet him there under false pretenses. That someone had been searching through the blackmail materials when Thornfield arrived, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder. The question was, who else in Little Wickham possessed both the skills to crack a safe and the motive to seek whatever secrets Thornfield had been hoarding? Her contemplations were interrupted by the arrival of Constable Fletcher, whose grim expression suggested that the morning had brought news of considerable import. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap respectfully, "I wonder if you might have observed anything unusual in the past few days. Any strangers about the village, or perhaps residents behaving in ways that seemed out of character." Miss Marple set down her pruning shears and gave the constable her full attention. "Has something else happened, Constable?" Fletcher's jaw tightened with obvious frustration. "Dr. Webb has gone missing. His housekeeper found his cottage empty this morning, with signs of a hasty departure. Clothes missing, medical bag gone, and his trap nowhere to be found." This revelation struck Miss Marple with the force of a physical blow, though she was careful to maintain her composed exterior. Webb's disappearance so soon after his insistence on Whitmore's innocence, and his plans to search the granary more thoroughly, suggested implications far more sinister than a simple change of residence. "How very peculiar," she murmured. "Did he leave any indication of where he might have gone?"
"None whatsoever."
Though his housekeeper mentioned that he seemed quite agitated yesterday evening, pacing about his study and muttering to himself about evidence and proof, Fletcher paused, then added grimly, "Given his recent claims about Thornfield's death being murder rather than accident, his sudden departure raises certain questions about his own possible involvement." Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications. If Dr. Webb had indeed fled the village, it suggested either guilt or mortal danger, and she was beginning to suspect the latter might be closer to the truth. "Has anyone thought to search his cottage thoroughly?" she inquired. "Perhaps he left some indication of his concerns or intentions." Fletcher's expression brightened slightly. "That's why I've come to you, Miss Marple. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that Dr. Webb had borrowed several books from you over the past months, medical texts and such. I wondered if you might accompany me to his cottage and help determine if anything significant is missing or out of place." The request was exactly what Miss Marple had been hoping for, though she was careful not to appear overly eager. "Of course, Constable, though I should warn you that my knowledge of medical matters is quite limited." Dr. Webb's cottage was a modest affair, reflecting the careful economy of a man starting over in middle age. The interior showed signs of hasty packing, drawers left partially open, papers scattered about, and the general air of someone who had departed with more urgency than preparation. Miss Marple examined the scene with the systematic thoroughness that had served her well in previous investigations, noting details that Fletcher's more conventional police training might overlook. In the study, she discovered something that made her pulse quicken with excitement. A small pile of ash in the fireplace, the remnants of recently burned papers. "Constable," she called softly, "I believe Dr. Webb destroyed some documents before his departure." Fletcher joined her at the fireplace, stirring the ashes with a poker in hopes of recovering some readable fragments. His efforts were largely unsuccessful, though they did uncover something unexpected: the twisted remains of what appeared to be a small metal key. Now, what would he want to burn a key for? Fletcher mused, holding up the blackened metal. Miss Marple examined the object with growing certainty about its significance. The key was small and ornate, exactly the sort that might open a decorative safe or strongbox. If her suspicions were correct, they had just discovered the implement used to break into Thornfield's private safe. Perhaps, she suggested carefully, Dr. Webb had been keeping something locked away that he preferred not to leave behind. As they continued their examination of the cottage, Miss Marple discovered additional evidence that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the doctor's final hours in Little Wickham. In his bedroom, she found a letter half-written and then abandoned, its visible lines revealing a fragment of what appeared to be a confession. "I can no longer live with the knowledge of what I have done. The weight of my actions has become unbearable, and I fear that my continued presence in this village will only bring harm to innocent people." Fletcher read the fragment with obvious satisfaction. "Well, there's our answer then. Dr. Webb killed Thornfield and fled when he realized the investigation was closing in on him." But Miss Marple was troubled by something in the letter's phrasing that didn't quite ring true. The handwriting was certainly Webb's, but there was a stilted quality to the language that suggested composition under duress rather than genuine remorse. "I wonder," she said thoughtfully, "if we might examine Dr. Webb's medical supplies. If he left in genuine haste, he might have overlooked something important." In the small room Webb had converted to a surgery, they found his medicine cabinet partially emptied, but with several interesting items remaining. Miss Marple noted the absence of certain drugs that would be useful for rendering someone unconscious, as well as the presence of others that suggested Webb had been treating someone for a chronic condition requiring regular medication. More significantly, she discovered a small appointment book tucked behind a row of medical journals. The final entry, dated the day before Webb's disappearance, contained a notation that made her blood run cold. Final consultation: CA cannot continue treatment under current circumstances. The initials could refer to several villagers, but given the context of her recent discoveries, Miss Marple was grimly certain they stood for Constance Ashford. If Webb had been treating the magistrate's wife for some ongoing medical condition, he would have been ideally positioned to learn about her connection to Thornfield and the blackmail that had dominated her life for 20 years. "Constable," she said urgently, "I believe we need to expand our investigation beyond Dr. Webb's possible guilt. There may be other lives at risk." Fletcher looked up from his examination of the medicine cabinet with obvious skepticism. "What makes you think that?" Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of running footsteps outside drew their attention to the cottage window. Young Billy Crather was racing up the path with a sort of desperate urgency that suggested fresh catastrophe. "Constable Fletcher," he gasped as he burst through the cottage door. "You need to come quick. It's Mrs. Ashford. She's taken terrible ill, and they can't find Dr. Webb anywhere to treat her." Miss Marple and Fletcher exchanged a look of grim understanding. The morning's discoveries had taken on a far more sinister complexion, and Miss Marple feared they were only beginning to understand the true scope of the evil that had taken root in their quiet village. As they hurried toward the magistrate's house, Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony of the situation. Webb's disappearance, which had initially seemed like evidence of his guilt, was beginning to look like the calculated removal of the one person who might have been able to save Constance Ashford's life. The real killer, she realized with chilling certainty, was not content with a single murder. They were systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their secret, and they possessed both the medical knowledge and the ruthless determination to make each death appear natural or accidental. The race to uncover the truth had become a race against time, with the lives of everyone who knew or suspected the killer's identity hanging in the balance. The scene at Ashford House was one of barely controlled chaos. Magistrate Harold Ashford, a distinguished man in his early 60s, whose judicial composure had abandoned him entirely, paced the front hall while their housekeeper wrung her hands and muttered about the terrible suddenness of her mistress's collapse. She was perfectly well at breakfast, Ashford was saying to anyone who would listen. Perhaps a touch pale, but nothing to suggest, and then suddenly she was doubled over in agony, retching violently, barely able to speak. Miss Marple followed Constable Fletcher into the house, her mind already working through the terrible implications of Constance's sudden illness. The timing, coming so soon after her midnight confession and Doc Webb's mysterious disappearance, suggested a connection far more sinister than mere coincidence. "Where is Mrs. Ashford now?" Fletcher inquired with professional briskness. "Upstairs in her room," Ashford replied distractedly. "I've sent Robert to fetch the doctor from Wickham Cross, but with these country roads, it could be hours before proper medical attention arrives." Miss Marple noted the reference to Robert Constance's son, and according to the hidden documents, Thornfield's illegitimate child. The young man would be approximately 23 now, probably unaware of the family secrets that had shaped his entire life. "Perhaps I might be of some assistance," she suggested gently. "I have some experience with sudden illnesses, and it's important to observe the symptoms carefully for the doctor's benefit." Ashford grasped at this offer with the desperation of a man watching his world collapse. Yes, of course. Mrs. Hartwell has been sitting with her, but another pair of experienced eyes." Miss Marple climbed the stairs to the master bedroom with the measured pace of someone who understood that haste often led to oversight. The sight that greeted her confirmed her worst fears. Constance Ashford lay in the large four-poster bed, her face waxy with perspiration and her breathing shallow and irregular. The characteristic smell in the room, bitter almonds masked by something sweeter, told its own story to anyone with sufficient knowledge to recognize it. Mrs. Hartwell, who had served as the Ashfords' housekeeper for nearly 15 years, looked up with relief at Miss Marple's arrival. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank goodness you're here. The poor dear has been in such agony, and I don't know what to do for her." Miss Marple approached the bedside with the calm efficiency that had served her well in previous crises. Constance's pupils were dilated, her pulse rapid and thready, and there was a distinctive blue tinge to her fingernails that confirmed the nature of her poisoning. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said quietly, "what did Mrs. Ashford have for breakfast this morning?" The housekeeper's brow furrowed with concentration. "The usual tea, toast with marmalade, and her morning medicine that Dr. Webb had prescribed for her digestion troubles. She's been taking it regular-like for the past several months." Miss Marple's suspicions crystallized with deadly clarity. This medicine, did Dr. Webb prepare it himself, or was it obtained from a chemist? "Oh, the doctor always mixed it fresh for her," Mrs. Hartwell replied proudly. "Said it was a special formula that needed to be prepared just so. Very particular about it, he was, and always brought it personally rather than sending it with a messenger." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place, with an almost audible click. Webb hadn't been treating Constance Ashford for digestive troubles. He had been slowly poisoning her, probably with small doses of some toxic substance that would eventually prove fatal, while appearing to be natural illness. His disappearance had forced him to accelerate his timeline, replacing the gradual poison with something more immediately lethal. "When did she last see Dr. Webb?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Yesterday evening, Miss Sy. He came by with her weekly supply of medicine, though he seemed quite agitated about something. Said it might be the last time he'd be able to treat her personally, on account of having to leave the village on urgent business." Miss Marple excused herself and returned downstairs to find Constable Fletcher questioning Magistrate Ashford about his wife's recent activities and associations. She drew the constable aside and quickly outlined her suspicions about the nature of Constance's illness. "Poison?" Fletcher's face went pale with shock. "But Dr. Webb was treating her. Why would he?" "I believe," Miss Marple said grimly, that Dr. Webb discovered something about Mrs. Ashford that made her dangerous to him. Rather than risk exposure, he chose to eliminate the threat through what would appear to be natural causes. Fletcher absorbed this revelation with the slow horror of a man realizing that his investigation had been proceeding along entirely wrong lines. "You think Webb killed Thornfield as well?" "I'm beginning to suspect that Dr. Webb has been far more active in our village affairs than anyone realized," Miss Marple replied. "The question now is whether we can save Mrs. Ashford's life and apprehend him before he disappears entirely." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Robert Ashford, with the doctor from Wickham Cross. The young man burst through the front door with the desperate energy of someone whose world was collapsing around him. "Father, how is she? I came as quickly as I could, but the roads—" He stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple and Constable Fletcher, his face registering confusion at their presence. Miss Marple studied Robert Ashford with the keen interest of someone seeing him clearly for the first time. He was tall and well-built, with dark hair and the sort of strong features that spoke of good breeding. But there was something about his eyes, pale blue and slightly cold, despite his obvious distress, that struck her as familiar. "Robert," his father said heavily, "your mother has taken suddenly ill. Dr. Morrison is examining her now." The young man's face went white with shock. But Miss Marple noted something else in his expression, a flicker of what might have been calculation rather than simple grief. It was gone so quickly that she might have imagined it, but her long experience with human nature had taught her to trust such fleeting impressions. "What sort of illness?" Robert demanded. "Was it something she ate? Had she been feeling unwell?" The questions were natural enough, but there was something in his tone that made Miss Marple's suspicions take a new and disturbing direction. If Robert Ashford had somehow learned of his true parentage and his mother's long history of blackmail, he would have had compelling reasons to want both Thornfield and Constance dead. And if he possessed medical knowledge, perhaps acquired during his education or through association with Dr. Webb, he would have had the means to accomplish both murders while directing suspicion toward others. "Constable Fletcher," she said quietly, "I wonder if we might have a word with young Mr. Ashford about his movements over the past few days. There may be details that could help us understand the full scope of what's been happening in our village." The look that passed between them conveyed Miss Marple's growing certainty that their investigation had taken yet another unexpected turn, and that the truth they were seeking lay closer to home than anyone had dared to imagine. In the distance, church bells began to toll the hour, their solemn notes carrying across the village, like a funeral dirge, for innocence lost and secrets finally coming to light. Dr. Morrison's examination of Constance Ashford confirmed Miss Marple's worst fears. The visiting physician, a competent man in his 50s who had served the surrounding villages for nearly 2 decades, emerged from the sick room with the grim expression of someone delivering a death sentence. "I'm afraid Mrs. Ashford has been poisoned," he announced to the assembled group in the drawing room. "The symptoms are consistent with arsenic administration, though the dosage appears to have been carefully calculated to suggest natural illness until this final, massive dose." Magistrate Ashford sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. "Poisoned? But that's impossible. Constance rarely leaves the house, and she eats nothing that we don't all share, except her medicine," Miss Marple interjected gently. "The special preparation that Dr. Webb had been providing for her digestive troubles." Robert Ashford, who had been standing by the window with his back to the room, turned sharply at this revelation. "You're suggesting that Dr. Webb was poisoning my mother? That's absurd. Why would he want to harm her?" Miss Marple studied the young man's face carefully, noting the controlled anger that seemed disproportionate to simple filial concern, perhaps because she knew something that made her dangerous to him. Or perhaps, she added quietly, because someone else wanted her silenced and found Dr. Webb a convenient instrument. The implications of this suggestion settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Constable Fletcher, who had been taking notes throughout the medical consultation, looked up with sudden comprehension. "You're saying Dr. Webb might have been acting on someone else's orders?" he asked. "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that Dr. Webb's sudden departure from the village suggests he may have outlived his usefulness to whoever was truly orchestrating these events." Robert moved away from the window, his pale blue eyes so strikingly similar to those Miss Marple remembered from her encounters with Edmund Thornfield. fixed on her with an intensity that was both calculating and dangerous. "Miss Marple," he said with deceptive calm, "you seem to have developed some rather elaborate theories about recent events. Perhaps you'd care to share them with all of us?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Miss Marple recognized it as the moment when the real killer finally felt compelled to step out of the shadows. She had seen it before, the point at which murderers became so confident in their cleverness that they couldn't resist engaging their perceived opponent in a battle of wits. "Very well," she said, settling into her chair with the air of someone preparing for a lengthy exposition. "I believe the sequence of events began several months ago, when someone discovered the existence of Edmund Thornfield's blackmail materials and decided to acquire them for their own purposes." Robert's expression remained carefully neutral, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested coiled energy awaiting release. "This person," she continued, "possessed both the technical skills to break into Thornfield's safe and the medical knowledge to dispose of inconvenient witnesses through apparently natural means. They enlisted Doc Webb's assistance, perhaps through blackmail or promises of financial reward, to eliminate anyone who might threaten their secret." Magistrate Ashford looked between his son and Miss Marple with growing confusion. "I don't understand. What secret could possibly be worth multiple murders?" Miss Marple's gaze never wavered from Robert's face as she delivered the revelation that would shatter whatever remained of the Ashford family's carefully constructed world. "The secret of Robert's true parentage," she said simply. "The fact that he is not your son, Harold, but rather the illegitimate child of Edmund Thornfield and your wife." The silence that followed this pronouncement was deafening. Magistrate Ashford stared at his wife's son, the young man he had raised as his own for 23 years, with the expression of someone watching their entire life crumble into ruins. Robert, for his part, abandoned all pretense of innocence. The mask of filial concern fell away, replaced by something cold and calculating that Miss Marple recognized as the face of a methodical killer. "Very clever, Miss Marple," he said with genuine admiration, "though I'm curious to know how you pieced it together." "The timing was the crucial element," she replied. "Dr. Webb's appointment book showed he had been treating your mother for months, ostensibly for digestive troubles, but actually administering small doses of poison that would eventually prove fatal. When I realized the true nature of their relationship, that she was being blackmailed by Thornfield over your parentage, it became clear that you had discovered the secret and decided to eliminate everyone who knew the truth." Robert began to pace the room with the restless energy of a predator preparing to strike. "Thornfield was bleeding us dry," he said with cold fury. "Every month, more demands for money, more threats to expose the truth. Mother was slowly dying from the stress of it. And father," he glanced at the magistrate with something approaching contempt, "father would have been destroyed professionally if the scandal became public. So you decided to solve the problem permanently," Miss Marple observed. "I decided to take control of the situation," Robert corrected. "I learned about safes and locks during my time at university, a useful skill that proved more valuable than any of my formal studies. Breaking into Thornfield's private safe was surprisingly simple once I understood the mechanism." Constable Fletcher, who had been listening to this confession with growing horror, finally found his voice. "You killed your own father." Robert's laugh was harsh and devoid of warmth. "Thornfield was never my father in any meaningful sense. He was a parasite who fed on other people's weaknesses and fears. The world is better off without him." "And Dr. Webb?" Miss Marple inquired. "How did you persuade him to assist in your mother's murder?" "Webb had his own secrets," Robert replied with satisfaction. "Something about a patient's death in London that had been covered up rather than properly investigated. I offered him a choice: help me solve my family's problem, or face renewed scrutiny of his past indiscretions." The pieces of the puzzle were finally arranging themselves into a complete picture, though Miss Marple took no satisfaction in being proven correct. The young man standing before them had orchestrated 3 deaths with the cold precision of someone who viewed human life as merely an obstacle to be removed. "But your mother survived Dr. Webb's final dose," she pointed out, "which means your secret is no longer safe." Robert's smile was chilling in its absolute lack of human warmth. "That can be remedied. Dr. Morrison has already confirmed that Mother is dying from arsenic poisoning. It will be tragic, but entirely believable, when her weakened system finally succumbs to the toxin. And the rest of us," Miss Marple asked with the calm of someone who had faced death before and found it less frightening than the living evil that sometimes wore human faces. Well, Robert said, thoughtfully, Father is already so distraught over Mother's condition that it wouldn't be surprising if his heart simply gave out from the stress. As for you, Miss Marple, and you, Constable Fletcher, I'm afraid you've learned far too much to be allowed to leave this house alive. The threat hung in the air like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads, and Miss Marple realized that their investigation had led them directly into the killer's trap. Robert Ashford had revealed his guilt because he was confident that none of them would survive to testify against him. The question now was whether her own careful preparations would prove sufficient to save their lives and bring this monstrous young man to justice. In the distance she could hear the sound of approaching horses, either rescue or reinforcement for their captor, depending on whose allies were arriving at Ashford House. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction as she recognized the voices calling out from the front courtyard. Her careful preparations had indeed borne fruit, though she had hoped they wouldn't prove necessary. "Expecting company, Robert?" she inquired mildly, noting the young man's sudden tension as multiple sets of footsteps could be heard entering the house below. Robert moved quickly to the drawing-room door, but before he could secure it, the portal swung open to admit a most welcome sight. Dr. Webb, very much alive and accompanied by two constables from the county seat, who had clearly come prepared for serious business. "Dr. Webb," Magistrate Ashford exclaimed in confusion. "But we thought, that is, everyone said you had fled the village." "I did indeed leave Little Wickham," Webb replied grimly, his eyes never leaving Robert's face. "But not as a fugitive. I went to secure help from the county authorities. When I realized the true scope of what we were dealing with." Robert's composure cracked for the first time, his pale blue eyes darting between the newcomers as he calculated his rapidly diminishing options. "This is ridiculous," he blustered. "Whatever lies this man has been telling you." "No lies," Webb interrupted firmly. "Simply the truth about how you've been systematically murdering anyone who threatened your secrets." He turned to address the room at large. "Robert Ashford has been blackmailing me for months, using knowledge of a patient's death in London to force my cooperation in his mother's slow poisoning." Miss Marple rose from her chair with the satisfied air of someone whose careful planning had reached its intended conclusion. "I took the liberty of sending a message to Dr. Webb through his housekeeper yesterday evening," she explained to the startled faces around her. "When I realized the true nature of Mrs. Ashford's illness and Dr. Webb's supposed flight, it became clear that he was as much a victim as anyone else." Robert's mask of civilized behavior finally fell away entirely, revealing the cold calculation that had driven him to multiple murders. "You meddling old witch," he snarled. "Do you have any idea what you've destroyed? I was trying to save my family from scandal and ruin. By murdering your biological father, attempting to poison your mother, and coercing an innocent doctor into being your accomplice." Miss Marple's voice carried the steel of absolute moral certainty. "I hardly think that constitutes salvation, my dear boy." One of the county constables stepped forward with handcuffs, but Robert wasn't finished with his revelations. Perhaps sensing that his capture was inevitable, he seemed determined to justify his actions to the bitter end. "Thornfield was destroying us piece by piece," he declared with passionate conviction. "Every month brought new demands, new threats to expose Mother's indiscretion. Father's career would have been ruined, our family name dragged through the mud, all because of one moment of weakness, 23 years ago." "So you decided to steal Thornfield's blackmail materials and eliminate him," Miss Marple observed. "I decided to take control of the situation," Robert corrected fiercely. "I learned about the hidden chest in the granary from overhearing one of Thornfield's conversations with Mother. Getting into his safe was child's play once I understood the mechanism, and arranging to meet him at the granary was simply a matter of sending the right message." Dr. Webb stepped closer, his face drawn with the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying an impossible burden. "He told me Thornfield had attacked him first, that he had acted in self-defense. I was too frightened of my own exposure to question his story carefully." "And Mrs. Ashford's poisoning?" Constable Fletcher inquired, his notebook ready to record the final details of the confession. Robert's expression twisted with something that might have been genuine regret. "That was necessary. Mother had become unstable. talking about confessing everything to clear her conscience. I couldn't allow that to happen. Too many people would have been destroyed by the truth. Miss Marple studied the young man with the sort of clinical detachment she might have applied to a particularly virulent disease. Including yourself, of course. If the truth about your parentage became public, you would lose not only your social position but also any claim to the Ashford family inheritance.
I worked for everything I achieved, Robert shot back with renewed fury.
My education, my prospects, my place in society, all of it built through my own efforts. I wasn't about to let some ancient scandal destroy my future. The county constables moved to arrest him, but Robert made one final attempt to justify his actions to the man he had always believed to be his father. Father, surely you understand. Everything I did was to protect our family, to maintain the life we had built together. The magistracy, your reputation, our standing in the community, all of it would have been lost if Thornfield's blackmail had continued. Magistrate Ashford looked at the young man he had raised with an expression of profound sadness that seemed to age him a decade in the space of a few moments. Robert, he said quietly, I have known about your true parentage since before you were old enough to walk. The admission struck the room like a thunderbolt. Robert stared at his adoptive father in shock, while Miss Marple felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. You knew? Robert whispered. Your mother confessed everything to me when you were still an infant. Ashford continued with the heavy dignity of someone unburdening a lifetime's worth of carefully guarded truth. I chose to raise you as my own son, because I loved your mother, and because you deserved a father who would guide you toward becoming a good man. The tragic irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present. Robert had committed multiple murders to protect a secret that had never needed protection, destroying the very people who had loved him, despite knowing the truth of his origins. Thornfield's blackmail had no power over us, Ashford explained with infinite sadness. I had already decided to retire from the bench at the end of this year, and your mother and I were planning to relocate to the continent where the old scandal would have no meaning. We were simply waiting for you to establish yourself independently before making the transition. Robert sagged between the two constables holding him, the weight of his unnecessary crimes finally crushing whatever remained of his self-justification. In trying to preserve a life built on secrets, he had destroyed everything that had ever made that life worth living. As the authorities led him away, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic waste of it all. 3 people had died, a family had been destroyed, and a young man's future had been forfeit, all because fear and pride had prevented honest communication between people who genuinely cared for one another. Dr. Webb, free at last from the blackmail that had controlled his actions, immediately turned his attention to treating Constance Ashford with the antidotes that might yet save her life. Whether she would survive her son's final desperate attempt to silence her remained to be seen, but at least she would receive proper medical care rather than carefully administered poison. Miss Marple, Magistrate Ashford said, as the immediate crisis began to settle into its aftermath. I don't know how to thank you for uncovering the truth, though I must say, I wish the truth had proved less devastating. Miss Marple looked out the window toward the village that had been the scene of so much recent tragedy, her expression thoughtful and sad. The truth is rarely comfortable, she replied gently, but it's always preferable to the alternatives. Secrets have a way of becoming more poisonous the longer they're kept, and your family has learned that lesson in the hardest possible way. As the sun began to set over Little Wickham, casting long shadows across the familiar lanes and cottages, Miss Marple prepared to return to her own quiet home. The village would recover from this tragedy, as villages always did, but the scars would remain as a reminder of how quickly civilization's thin veneer could be stripped away when fear and desperation took control. In her long experience with the darker aspects of human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who convinced themselves they were acting from noble motives. Robert Ashford would face justice for his crimes, but the true tragedy lay in the realization that none of it had been necessary, that love and honesty might have prevented the entire catastrophe if fear had not made them impossible. 3 weeks after Robert Ashford's arrest, Little Wickham was slowly beginning to find its equilibrium again, though the events of that terrible September had left their mark on everyone who called the village home. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a crisp October morning, watching the last of the autumn roses bloom with the particular poignancy that comes after surviving a brush with genuine evil. The sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path drew her attention, and she looked up to see James Whitmore making his way toward her cottage. The young artist had returned to Little Wickham the previous week, his name cleared and his reputation restored, though the experience had clearly left him changed in ways both subtle and profound. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap respectfully, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to thank you properly for everything you did to establish my innocence." She gestured to the bench beside her, setting aside her knitting to give him her full attention. "Not at all, Mr. Whitmore. I'm delighted to see you looking so much better. I trust your time away wasn't too distressing." James settled onto the bench with the careful movements of someone still recovering from a profound shock. "Distressing enough," he admitted. "Sleeping rough and constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that every stranger might be a constable come to arrest me for murder. But I suppose it gave me time to think about what I really wanted from life." Miss Marple noted the maturity in his voice that hadn't been there before the crisis. Adversity, she reflected, had a way of either destroying people or forging them into something stronger than they had been before. In James Whitmore's case, it appeared to have been the latter. "And what conclusions did you reach?" she inquired gently. "That running away solves nothing," he replied with conviction. "I should have stayed and faced the accusations directly, trusted that the truth would eventually emerge. Instead, my cowardice nearly resulted in an innocent woman being charged with murder." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "You're referring to Miss Bellwether, I assume, though I believe her involvement was rather more complicated than simple innocence." James nodded gravely. "Constable Fletcher told me about her financial troubles and her encounter with Thornfield that night. I can't help feeling responsible for her distress. If I hadn't argued with Thornfield so publicly, perhaps none of this would have happened." "My dear young man," Miss Marple said with gentle firmness, "you cannot hold yourself responsible for the actions of a disturbed individual like Robert Ashford. His crimes were the result of choices he made, not circumstances you created." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching a pair of robins search for insects among the fallen leaves. Finally, James spoke again, his voice carrying a note of cautious optimism. "I've decided to stay in Little Wickham permanently," he announced. "Magistrate Ashford, poor man, he's aged terribly through all this, has given me permission to convert the granary into a proper studio. Says it might help the village heal to see something beautiful created from a place where such terrible things happened." Miss Marple smiled with genuine pleasure. "How wonderful! And I suppose the village will benefit from having a resident artist to document its better moments." "That's my hope," James agreed. "Though I must admit, I'll never be able to work in that loft without thinking about what transpired there. Some memories are harder to paint over than others." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a small trap approaching along the lane announced the arrival of Dr. Webb, who had become a regular visitor to Miss Marple's cottage in the weeks since the crisis had resolved. The physician looked considerably better than he had during those dark days when Robert's blackmail had controlled his actions, though he still carried the weight of someone who had been forced to compromise his professional ethics. "Miss Marple, Mr. Whitmore," he said as he secured his horse. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important?" "Not at all, Doctor," Miss Marple replied. "We were just discussing Mr. Whitmore's plans for the granary. How is Mrs. Ashford progressing?" Dr. Webb's expression brightened considerably. "Remarkably well, considering the amount of arsenic in her system. The antidotes proved effective, and her natural constitution is stronger than I initially feared. She should make a complete recovery, though it will take several more months." This news brought visible relief to James's face. Despite having no direct connection to Constance Ashford, he had been carrying guilt about her suffering ever since learning the full scope of Robert's crimes. "And her mental state?" Miss Marple inquired delicately. "That's more complex," Webb admitted. "Learning that her son was responsible for Edmund Thornfield's death and her own poisoning has been devastating. But she's finding some comfort in the knowledge that her husband knew about Robert's parentage all along and loved them both, despite the scandal." Miss Marple nodded understanding. "Sometimes the truth, however painful, proves less destructive than the fear of its revelation." "Indeed," Webb agreed. "Though I must say, Magistrate Ashford has shown remarkable strength throughout this ordeal. He's already making arrangements to provide for Robert's legal defense, despite everything that's happened. A father's love doesn't end with disappointment, Miss Marple observed quietly. Though I fear Robert will have many years to contemplate the consequences of his actions. The three sat together in contemplative silence as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening. Finally, Dr. Webb rose to take his leave, mentioning a patient in the next village who required his attention. "Before you go, Doctor," Miss Marple said, "I've been meaning to ask about your plans for the future. Will you be staying in Little Wickham permanently?" Webb's expression grew thoughtful. "I believe so, yes. This community has seen me at my worst, and somehow found it in their hearts to forgive my weaknesses. That kind of grace deserves to be repaid with better service than I've provided in the past." After the doctor's departure, James and Miss Marple continued their quiet conversation as the sun set over the familiar landscape of Little Wickham. The young artist spoke of his plans for documenting the village's history through his hikings, while Miss Marple shared stories of the community's resilience through various crises over the decades. "You know," James said eventually, "people keep asking me if I'll paint the granary as it was during those terrible events. They seem to think there's something romantic about the scene of a murder." Miss Marple's expression grew stern. "I hope you'll resist such requests. There's nothing romantic about the taking of human life, regardless of the circumstances." "Oh, absolutely," James assured her quickly. "If anything, I'd prefer to paint it as it will be, a place where beauty is created rather than destroyed. Perhaps that's the best memorial for everyone who suffered through this tragedy." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Miss Marple reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this point. Edmund Thornfield's death had seemed like a simple case of accident or obvious murder, but the truth had proved far more complex and tragic than anyone could have imagined. A young man's desperate attempt to protect secrets that didn't need protection had destroyed multiple lives and torn apart the very family he thought he was saving. Yet from that destruction, new understanding and stronger relationships were beginning to emerge. "I think," she said finally, "that Little Wickham will be stronger for having survived this trial. Communities, like individuals, often discover their true character only when faced with genuine adversity." James nodded agreement, then rose to take his leave as the evening chill began to settle over the garden. "Thank you again, Miss Marple, for everything you did. I don't think any of us will ever fully understand how you managed to unravel such a complex web of deception." Miss Marple smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life's work had once again proved its value. "Human nature follows certain patterns, Mr. Whitmore. Once you learn to recognize those patterns, even the most elaborate deceptions become surprisingly transparent." As she watched the young artist make his way back toward the village center, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to go inside for the evening. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and mysteries, as tomorrow always did, but tonight she was content to sit quietly with the knowledge that justice had been served and healing had begun. In the distance, the old granary stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, no longer a monument of violence and deception, but a symbol of renewal and the possibility that even the darkest chapters could give way to brighter ones. By Christmas, she reflected, it would echo with the sounds of artistic creation rather than tragic confrontation. And that, perhaps, was the best ending any story could hope for.